Okay, we're going to talk about some really heavy stuff now. Data. Data and ESG. Hi, I'm Andrew Mitchell. I'm the moderator for this panel. And I'm one of the founders of the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is everything you need to do beyond carbon. Some of you have probably got familiar with the TCFD and the kind of data you need to be amassing to deal with carbon disclosures. Well, I'm going to be a bit biased because I'm going to be asking our panel a bit about nature-related disclosures, but, which is a whole new area. But this is about harnessing ESG data for better reporting and business performance. And it's sponsored by Deloitte, so thank you, Deloitte. I'm going to introduce the panel in a minute. The aim is to future-proof your company for potential new regulations and investor demand for ESG credentials. It's essential to use data, of course, to be able to do that. So our panel is going to have a look at how you might develop an ESG data strategy and how you can monitor your ESG goals with collecting of data and the agility and accuracy around that. So I'd like to just introduce the panel first. So next door to me is Veronica Poole, who's Global IFRS and Corporate Reporting Leader at Deloitte. Veronica, welcome. Next door is Stephanie Niven, who's Portfolio Manager and Global Sustainable Equity at 91, which is an asset manager. And next door to Stephanie, we have Emma Stewart, who's from Netflix. Most people know what Netflix is, but you probably don't know so much about their ESG and how they might go about dealing with the data around that. So we'll be interested to hear that from you, Emma. And then Elko at the end there, Elko van der Enden, Chief Executive of the Global Reporting Initiative, which again, many of you will already know of. So please welcome our panel. So Veronica, I want to turn to you first around this. Tell us, what are you telling your clients they should have as a sort of ESG strategy? And what are they telling you about what they need?
Let me perhaps start with what they're telling us. What they're telling us is that the recent conversation around whether ESG is a fad, a bubble that is about to burst, is really not that relevant in the corporate world, not in the boardroom. Because I think the corporate world has got to recognize, just the same way as the investor community, that this conversation is really not about some political issues or some bubble effects. This conversation is about material issues. Issues material to the business's ability to create value over time. It directly affects profitability, it directly affects balance sheets, and the whole conversation around the future resilience is not really feasible without focusing on those issues. So it's very much top of mind for the boards. But what is challenging is the how-to. Because what we currently have today is, of course, an interesting challenge. We have been reporting on sustainability issues for a while. We have a lot of sustainability data, but what we don't have is the robust discipline behind the sustainability data as we have for financial reporting data. So financial reporting data, you have good governance, internal controls, you have a well-established process, you have got full-on accountability. But with the ESG data, we have often had it treated very much as something for investor relations, perhaps, or something for specialist interest groups, or for certain specific stakeholder engagement. So historically, it did not sit as part of your mainstream enterprise risk management process, or internal controls, or governance, and rarely featured in the board discussions. So what the company needs to do now is travel the journey and travel it really fast from this situation to where the sustainability data is treated the same way as the financial data. And that's the organizational transformation. So the question is about how do I do an organizational transformation, redefine my KPIs, bring the right governance discipline, and build it all the way through to my communications and transparency conversation very quickly. There is another driver, of course, which is always a driver behind the scenes, is that, of course, investors and regulators are also very interested in this data because, as we know, these are material issues that are directly relevant to the resilience of financial markets. And so there is a conversation there around what is reported, because this data needs to be comparable, it needs to be consistent, and needs to display appropriate attributes of faithful representation, it needs to be timely, it needs to be relevant to decision-making. That basically means decision-making of the investor, as well as the decision-making of the management. It also needs to be absolutely comparable from company to company. So that basically means we need reporting standards. And that is why the ISSB, being announced at COP26, was such an enormous step forward. That was an absolutely historical development that is setting us on a path to consistent reporting. But this will only happen if the whole ecosystem moves. It won't happen if we just have the standards and the willingness by companies to report. We need more. We need key elements of that ecosystem to come and shape up. And what are they? So we really need to put behind this legislation and regulations that brings the standards into the laws and regulations of a particular jurisdiction. We absolutely need monitoring and enforcement. We absolutely need capacity building within the system, learning, education. But we also need assurance. Assurance becomes quite critical here because data quality and trust in sustainability data is very low. Now, and of course, here lies the challenge. If my governance and controls and my processes are not mature enough to get it to the level where it can be relied upon by the board in the decision-making to make very important decisions on, say, trade-offs between the short-term and long-term considerations. So current environment, that's exactly what we need to be doing. Political, geopolitical uncertainty, as well as economic uncertainty, puts this trade-off conversation at the heart of the boardroom. And without that data, assurable, reliable, consistent, comparable to what competitors are doing, I can't make informed decisions. Now, well, that's a conversation.
Well, we'll come back to that. I'd like to come back to the ISSB a bit too, if we get time. Now, Stephanie, you've heard this is... Veronica's laid out what we should do. How does that affect you as an asset manager? What are you hearing from the companies that you're investing in? And what are you asking them to do?
So, hello everyone. I very much agree with a lot of what you've laid out there, and there's a real need now to put sustainability and ESG matters right at the heart of how we as investors think about business models going forward. And I would reflect some of those comments that this is about long-term business sustainability. It's about resilience, and it's about understanding how companies incorporate these factors into their opportunities, into their risk, and ultimately into their growth and returns through time. Now, 91, who you might know as Investec, we rebranded 2 years ago, they think very much about sustainability with substance. So this is about, incorporating across the whole spectrum of ESG factors, that idea of what really matters. And I guess this is what I bring to the panel today, is that idea that we need ESG data to be transparent. We can work towards very complex, very, sophisticated ways to think about scope 3, but if the investment community and if the board can't understand what those elements within that calculation are, that's not always going to be the most helpful approach. So we need to think about making things simple, making things understandable, and making things comparable. And I think the second element that I would say the investment community really cares about is transparency that comes through providing qualitative data as well. So I don't see that we can distill everything that we value today down to numbers. We need to be prepared to say, you know what, we can measure carbon, and that's fantastic. But there's elements within biodiversity, like land use, that we can't measure today. There's elements within water, water stress, which is perhaps the more important element relative to, say, water usage. So we need to think about providing qualitative, analysis. That's what I want to see from the businesses that I engage in, not just numbers. We need to combine the two, and we need to be prepared to build frameworks around that.
So let me turn now to Netflix what this. As I say, tell us a bit about. We all know what Netflix is. Some of us probably use it. Probably quite a lot of us use Netflix. But what are the kind of data challenges that you're facing inside the company around these ESG issues? Because most people won't be thinking about ESG when they're watching a Netflix film.
Well, we started late in that I was the first sustainability hire, and that was in late 2020. So we were behind a lot of our peers in terms of collecting this data, analyzing it, and setting targets. But in classic Netflix fashion, we moved quickly and tried to disrupt ourselves multiple times over. And so 6 months after my first hire date, we were able to have produced 3 different carbon footprints, get them all third-party assured, and set 2 different public climate targets. So that was October through March. And that's partially enabled by a company that is very data-centric, very data-savvy. But these were types of data that have not traditionally been collected. So we were asking hundreds of people around the company for numbers that literally they had never thought about. So that took some doing. Now we're really trying to institutionalize this within teams outside of my department, whether that's internal audit or enterprise risk management or financial reporting, country by country, and to actually bring greenhouse gas accounting skills into those teams so that it's not entirely reliant on the sustainability department. And the inflection point that the field finds itself in right now, we've spent 20 years reporting voluntarily to investor-driven frameworks, which has been wonderful and really filled a gap, I think, in standardized government-mandated reporting. But now we're at this inflection point where companies like ours are wrestling with, as we move from voluntary reporting and the famous alphabet soup of the many, many different disclosure frameworks out there, which I know and applaud ISSB for wrestling into a more harmonized framework. We're now moving into a world where each country is going to be asking us different questions in a different form. And so the data that we're collecting not only has to be high quality and have good chain of custody oversight, it has to be easily sliced and diced into all of the different ways that countries will be asking for this information. So we thought we were transitioning from a world of multiple frameworks. Well, we're transitioning into a world of mandatory multiple frameworks. So the job doesn't get any easier, but it does mean that this instinct to embed the expertise and the accountability for that data into the traditional business functions is that much more easily justified because now this is just a part of financial reporting.
Thank you. So, Elko, GRI has been doing a lot in this space for a long time in creating the standards. That people, when we talk about data in the ESG space, we get a great common cry. There's a lot of data around, but it isn't necessarily decision grade. We're not quite sure what metrics to use, but above all, what standards should we be using? And what standards do you see emerging? Are we okay in the climate space? But what about after that?
I think we are pretty much okay in the climate space. And why do I say that? We have the initiative of the ISSB, of course. And I very much welcome the incorporation of the ISSB, our colleagues. And as you may perhaps know, we're working on this 2-pillar global structure for a global comprehensive baseline for reporting so that we have one set of data around the globe, which will be extremely helpful, not only for investors, but also for businesses, as well as for society. So climate, we see ISSB, we see the SEC, and we see the initiative at EFRAG. And they all use more or less the same basis of the TCFD. But what I see now developing is a wish to get more behind what it does mean. So how does climate change affect human rights? How does greenhouse gas affect social happiness? And so forth. So more interaction and correlation between the various topics into what we call sector standards. And we hope shortly to announce with ISSB a joint project where we will be more drilling into this. And listening to what the previous speaker said, I am so surprised by some initiatives in some states in the United States where they try to avoid organizations to push on these important societal topics and climate topics because it is appear to be woke, leftish, and not good for business. And I don't get that because to me, ESG, and I'm from business, is long-term risk management. How can you, as a lawmaker, try to pursue a path where you ask boardrooms not to take serious their fiduciary duty towards investors and stakeholders. How is it possible that when you are in retail, you will not take into account the effects of global warming on your business models, additional cooling, your energy policy, your diversification? When you are in IT and a platform industry, if you do not take into account social affairs, happiness, safe workplace, equal pay, diversity, it will hit your bottom line. And what if your anti-bribery policy is not embedded within your risk and control framework? What happened to a Dutch organization last week? They will go bankrupt over a bribery case in Saudi Arabia. How can you, as a lawmaker, ask from business and investors not to take this topic serious? I don't get it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, data and quality of data. We had an interesting, what you said, Stephanie, the balance between values and valuations, qualitative data and quantitative data. And I wanted to ask you, Veronica, a bit about that. Because does that come up in your conversations with companies? Because some people say to me, why is it the finance sector so obsessed with numbers? And sometimes you can see what you have to do, but it may not show up in a spreadsheet, so we're not going to, that's kind of crazy. So how do we get this balance between what we know we can collect information on and other stuff?
Well, you're sitting here in the UK. This is the country where there is a history of reporting in line with Section 172, which is the section that explicitly requires directors to have regard to broader interests, the impact on climate, society, on broader stakeholders. And there is a regime that already includes reporting in accordance with strategic report. What strategic report, other than a narration of your governance, of your approach to strategic thinking about these issues, your business model, how it integrates, all of that. All of that is narrative. This is the context that Stephanie was talking about. You need that context in order to understand the numbers. Even in the financial world, if you think about the financial world today, nothing is black and white. There is tons of uncertainty that we are now navigating through judgments and estimates that are in the financial statements. And in order to understand anything in the financial statements, you actually need to look to what underpins the judgments and estimates. The context is equally important there. So narrative reporting is not exactly new. Narrative reporting exists and always existed. We always disclosed quite a lot of contextual information. The challenge here is the fact that potentially people get scared by something that is forward-looking, something that has got multiple layers of uncertainty, because we just talked about all the interactions between different sustainability topics, but it is also different time horizons. It's not data necessarily or information which is within my direct control of my companies. I have to go beyond into the value chain, into the customer relationships in order to understand some of that data. So there is that uncertainty associated with the quality of the data that is feeding through the value chain. So all of those issues then create this nervousness around reporting, nervousness around how I describe that uncertainty. But it doesn't mean we should stop. I think the whole point about this is to provide the right context. We must put this information in context. We need to explain the assumptions that we're making that are underpinning our calculations of, say, Scope 3. Because otherwise, what comparability, what understanding? None.
Okay, well, I mean, a lot of businesses are just dealing with Scope 1, Scope 3. What's that? It's on the horizon out there. But yes, and often most of the emissions and things are actually way down the supply chain. But Stephanie, coming to you again, I just want to talk about data and materiality a bit, because a lot of the time with finance institutions, particularly investors, they say, well, we're looking for data, we're looking for materiality here. And with nature-related stuff, if you go looking for materiality, you probably won't find it. Because it's called an externality, because we live in a world of private profits and public losses. So, to make it simple for everyone, you trash a rainforest to grow palm oil, the cost of losing the rainforest is not in the share price of the company. So I see you guys with these great data screens and things, and I imagine there's a whole other screen here that's got natural capital written on it, and there's nothing in it. So how are you, it's coming. 10 years ago, there was very little in it, but it's coming in now. So how are you dealing with this, the externality data that's not really there?
So it's interesting you bring up the word externalities, because that is what sits right at the heart of the way we think as investors about sustainability and about ESG. So we have a view that those externalities will be increasingly valued and priced by the market. So what that means, well, and you've seen it in carbon, is that the market will wake up and look and see what businesses have a lot of climate risk in their business operations and where there's a lot of carbon opportunity, and begin to price that into the multiples they pay for the businesses today. We're also seeing that more broadly. So we are seeing businesses like Croda, businesses like Autodesk begin to see that investor interest in some of the initiatives and some of the opportunities they have in biodiversity. But you're right that we need to do things differently. And I think that's very much a challenge we've put out there to the investment community. You know, we can't rely on our old frameworks anymore. We can't rely just on spreadsheets. And you're right, we need to do a lot more work. We need to understand the nuances. We need to understand, you know, even simple things like where business operations are and what that means. That's difficult to put into a spreadsheet. It's difficult to just, you know, let the quant model spit out an answer. So there's a real role and opportunity, I think, for active investors to really sort of stand up and say, these are the things that are important. And I think if I just link back to one of the comments you made, Elko, this is about time horizon, I think. So, you know, we do see people say, oh, you know, well, you've seen what's happened to energy prices recently and whatnot. And that's a very short-term way of thinking about it. But you're right, this is about, you know, will these businesses that, you know, cut down forests in Finland today, will they survive in 20 years if they haven't thought about the biodiversity impact of that supply chain? So it's about thinking, you know, will this business be a long-term, you know, ongoing business model or not? And there's so many different nuances to that opportunity.
Why do I need that? Was this not working? Okay, good. Well, I think that's working. Interesting. You mentioned location, actually. I just want to pick up on that because there's a big difference between, say, climate data and nature data, because locate is the first letter of the framework we're developing for TNFD, which is called LEAP, which is locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare whatever you report. Now, location data is not routinely collected, right? Do you know the location of all your assets? I bet you don't. So how are we going to deal with that, location data?
Well, I think it's about awareness. So it's about being long-term enough to understand the businesses you're investing in, and then it's about awareness. So, you know, the same action can be performed, you know, carbon extraction, or, you know, can be performed across the globe and it has the same impact. But the same impact, you know, cutting down an acre of forest, it has a very different impact across the world. So, you know, biodiversity, for example, is spatially contextual. You know, these things matter. And I think it's just about understanding that and sort of saying we need data, but we need to understand it as well.
Emma, can I turn to you? Because we've been talking a bit about nature, and I mentioned forests. And now I was interested to see on your website that you actually are involved with forests in trying to manage your carbon footprint. And whether you like or don't like the word offset or carbon credits, natural climate solutions, I'm not so much interested in that debate. But how do you collect data that makes you feel confident that the forestry projects you're investing in are good projects? Tell us a bit about that.
I just want to go back to one thing Stephanie said. We in the sustainability profession used to say a ton is a ton is a ton, right? That no matter where an emission happened, it didn't really matter because the atmosphere would collect it regardless. That completely overlooks the impact of co-benefits of investing in nature-based solutions. So all of the water, air, community, job, toxic filtration benefits of investing in nature are all hyper-location specific. So that's one of the things we try and do as we procure carbon credits, is we prioritize those that will have what are currently called co-benefits, but that some people in the nature space might actually see the carbon capture and storage as the co-benefit. It depends upon your perspective. So the two public climate targets that I mentioned earlier, one is to have our own emissions by 2030, so a validated science-based target, as they're called. And the second is an additional commitment that starting this year and for every year thereafter, we will purchase high-quality carbon credits in the same amount as any residual emissions across all three scopes. And that's starting this December, so clock is ticking. So we've actually put out rather major RFPs to many countries in the world seeking about 1.5 million metric tons of carbon. We've vetted over 150 million metric tons worth of carbon credit projects. And we've ultimately landed and contracted with 17 different project developers directly. We put each project through a 5-step screen, including, of course, they have to be third-party validated by one of the Big Four protocols, but we also directly interview the project developers on the ground. Once the pandemic is hopefully fully past us, we'll be able to visit them as well. And then we look for technological M&V on top of the due diligence that we ourselves do. We also prioritize credits that come with a community and biodiversity benefit, so a CCB certification. So we're very proud of that portfolio. There are also some really nice ties to what you might see on the Netflix service. We had Barack Obama give David Attenborough a run for his money. I'm sorry, I know that that's heresy to say in London. But we think he did a pretty nice job. And he narrated Our Great National Parks, which is an international television series about the world's wild places and how they're protected. And as part of that effort, we actually invested in a carbon credit project out of eastern Kenya that creates a migratory corridor between the two arms of the national park. So you had 11,000 elephants trying to migrate between two forest fragments. And this project, the Kasagao project, has created hundreds of thousands of local benefits and jobs for the communities that live there. On November 11th, right in the middle of COP, we're releasing the second season of Down to Earth with Zac Efron, which is like a travel show for making sustainability solutions fun, hip, and dare I say, sexy. And as part of that effort, we invested in a carbon credit project in Australia because the second season features all of these incredible stories from around that continent, a biodiversity corridor called Yara Yara. So there's clear ties for our consumers back to our core product of storytelling, but also an important part, we think, of the action that needs to happen this decade on climate.
Thank you, Emma. So, Elko, coming to you, standards. I want to come back. I'd like to hear what you think about the task ahead for ISSB. It's a pretty big one to amalgamate climate standards, but where are we on nature standards? Water, forest, landscapes, oceans, that kind of stuff. And we talked a bit about social as well, social stuff, which is much more important in the US, in a sense, than it is in Europe. Europe is good on environment. US is good on the S of ESG. Where do you all see all this evolving?
Well, we will, I hope, release in November next year our biodiversity standard. And there's more up and running. What you typically see is that also depending the cultural background of certain nations, some topics are more sensitive than other topics. How do we see the landscape evolving? I really strongly believe that it will be, when we speak on the E, the S and the G, it will be like this joint venturist approach between ISSB and GRI. I think it is a proof of concept. It's there for now. Well, we are there for now 25 years. They're the new kids on the block, but with the IFRS Foundation, of course, also 20 years. They are the enterprise value side, which is basically the outside in. What are the effects on the enterprise value of the organization? We are the inside out. What are the impacts a business has in pursuing its strategic objectives on society, on climate, and so forth? So they are like two sides of the same coin. What I think is extremely interesting and what we should take into account, and as a former Big Four partner, I love valuation and I love profit. But is that the biggest assets you have is an intangible asset and you can't find it on your balance sheet. And that's your reputation and your brand name. And all the examples mentioned have clearly a very positive impact on your reputation and your brand name. So the idea that this is not measurable, so it is not real, it's not tangible, it is. And the boardrooms I am in, these topics, and then especially now on the social and on the governance, get more attention. Because businesses understand that although the E is easy to understand for everyone, you can measure it. There's quantitative and qualitative data. You put a filter in a factory and suddenly you have less pollution. But we get from some very large US funders now requests if we would like to think about drafting a policy engagement standard. Policy engagement is a polite word for lobbying. Because they want to see that organizations and companies put their money where their mouth is. So if you claim to have a net zero commitment by 2030, but you pay $5 million a year to a lobby that is fighting any new legislation that curbs greenhouse gases expulsion, then something is wrong there. So here again, you have those correlations that you see between actual behavior and the effects on the S and the G. So we will see an increased interest in the S and the G. Are businesses struggling with that, collecting data? Yes, they are, because it is new and it is not embedded in their reporting systems. But we get now exactly the same questions that I got like 20, 25 years ago with the introduction of international accounting standards. How do I build a framework around extracting data and enable me to report those efficiently in a comparable manner? So it's just a question of time until ESG reporting is as embedded in the soul and the daily operational processes of businesses as is financial reporting.
Well, thank you, folks. We're out of time. We're out of time, so I would just summarize it a bit like this. I think, you know, we used to be running businesses a bit like driving a 1950s motor car, where you just had a petrol gauge and a speedometer to tell you how fast you were going. Well, you know, with climate, we're not quite a Tesla. We can't quite take our hands off the wheel and go to sleep in the back. But with nature, we're really back in the 1950s. Modern cars today have a staggering dashboard of information that keeps you safe. And that's really the way we should be thinking about running our businesses and our finance houses. We need to get those kinds of dashboards that are going to keep your businesses safe, the planet safe. And that's where we need to get to. We're not quite there yet, but it's all about the data we're collecting. So please, will you thank the speakers very much? Thank you.